Hey guys, tonight we're talking about the Dutch tulip bubble. Not the wild, chaotic frenzy you've heard about. No, we're doing the real version. The one where a flower becomes mildly popular, then slightly overvalued, then, well, nothing all that dramatic happens, honestly. But let's pretend it's thrilling anyway. Picture this, you're in 16th century Europe, and someone hands you a tulip bulb. It's just a lump of plant matter, really. No scent, no immediate payoff, just the vague promise of a flower next spring, if you don't accidentally rot it in storage. And yet, somehow, this becomes the hottest commodity in the Netherlands. You probably wouldn't have survived the hype, not because it was dangerous, but because the paperwork alone would have put you to sleep. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always fun to see who's drifting off to this in the middle of the day. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Tulips arrived in Europe the way most mildly interesting things did back then. Slowly, accidentally, and with a lot of bureaucratic red tape. They weren't even Dutch at first, they were Ottoman imports, brought over by diplomats and merchants who thought they'd make nice gifts. Imagine being the guy who unloaded a crate of bulbs in Antwerp, only to realize nobody knew what to do with them. Just plant them, I guess. The early adopters were botanists, the kind of people who got excited about plant taxonomy and soil acidity. Historians still argue whether the first Dutch tulip bloom was in 1593 or 1594, because, shockingly, no one thought to document it properly. But here's a quirky tidbit: some of those early bulbs were broken. Not metaphorically, literally cracked open, which turned out to be a good thing. The fractures caused streaks of color in the petals, making them more exotic. So, naturally, the Dutch decided these defective flowers were premium. For decades, tulips were just a niche hobby for rich gardeners. No mania, no speculation, just guys in fancy hats arguing over whose blooms had the faintest pink stripe. It was the botanical equivalent of collecting vintage spoons. And yet, this was the quiet beginning of what would later be called a bubble. A very, very slow bubble. You're now in the early 1600s, where tulips have settled into Dutch soil with all the excitement of a slightly damp sponge. These flowers aren't popping up overnight. No, they're taking their sweet time, because tulips operate on botanical bureaucracy. Each bulb requires a full year to flower, assuming it doesn't succumb to rot, rodents, or the sheer indifference of the universe. Imagine waiting 12 months for a plant to maybe bloom, only for it to produce something that looks suspiciously like last year's. That's the tulip trade for you. The Dutch climate, with its drizzle and overcast skies, shouldn't have been ideal for tulips, yet somehow they adapted. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the same gradual inevitability as paint drying. Historians still argue whether the bulbs thrived because of the Dutch weather or in spite of it, but here's a quirky tidbit. Some growers believed talking to their plants helped. There are records of wealthy men whispering encouragement to their tulip beds, as if flattery could speed up photosynthesis. Spoiler: it didn't. Meanwhile, the actual process of cultivating tulips was about as thrilling as watching a canal freeze. Growers had to navigate a labyrinth of guild regulations, soil pH debates, and the ever-present risk of a bulb simply not doing anything. No dramatic failures, no explosive successes, just a lot of waiting around for something to happen. And yet, this was the foundation of an entire economic phenomenon. A staggeringly boring one. You're strolling through a Dutch nobleman's garden in the 1610s when you overhear the most tedious conversation imaginable. Two men in absurdly large ruffs are debating tulip petal curvature like it's a matter of national security. The bend on this one is clearly superior. See how it arcs 12 degrees instead of 10. This, my friend, is how viral trends worked in the 17th century. No TikTok dances, just aristocrats trying to one-up each other with floral geometry. The tulip's rise as a status symbol happened with all the spontaneity of continental drift. Wealthy collectors, the same people who owned exotic seashells and clocks that didn't keep time properly, decided these flowers were the ultimate flex. Not because they were beautiful, though some were, but because they were difficult to obtain. A single bulb could cost as much as a skilled worker's yearly wages, which tells you everything about Dutch priorities. Historians still argue whether this was conspicuous consumption or just collective boredom, but here's a quirky tidbit. Some buyers never even saw their flowers bloom. They traded bulbs like baseball cards, still wrapped in dirt, based entirely on sellers' descriptions. The 1600s equivalent of ordering mystery boxes online. Meanwhile, the actual process of acquiring tulips involved enough paperwork to numb your brain. Purchase contracts listed specifications like 1 Semper Augustus bulb, hopefully with those cool streaks but no guarantees. There were disputes over whether a bulb counted as medium-sized. Answer: whatever the seller said it was. The Dutch invented modern capitalism and immediately used it to argue about plant sizes. Welcome to the thrilling world of 17th century tulip bureaucracy, where the paperwork was more abundant than the flowers themselves. You're now a bulb merchant in 1620s Amsterdam, spending your days drafting contracts so dense they could double as doorstops. Every transaction requires notarization, witness signatures, and clauses addressing every possible botanical disaster, right down to what if the bulb spontaneously turns to mush before delivery. Answer: tough luck, buyer. The Dutch guild system, never one to miss an opportunity to overcomplicate things, established strict rules about who could sell tulips and how. Want to trade bulbs? Better hope you're in the right guild, with the right connections, and have the patience to sit through meetings debating whether a striped tulip should cost more than a flamed one. Historians still argue whether these regulations stabilized the market or just created more red tape, but here's a quirky tidbit. Some contracts included tulip futures, agreements to buy bulbs that hadn't even been planted yet. That's right, they were basically trading imaginary flowers. And let's not forget the quality control debates. Disputes over bulb size, weight, and vitality, a term so vague it might as well mean vibes, could drag on for months. There are records of buyers returning bulbs for being insufficiently promising, which sounds like something a disappointed parent would say. Meanwhile, the actual tulips just sat there, oblivious to the chaos, taking their sweet time to grow. Now we arrive at the heart of the tulip phenomenon, the world's most lackluster speculative market. Picture yourself in a 1630s Amsterdam tavern, where men in drab woolen suits trade promissory notes for tulip bulbs that won't bloom for another 8 months. There's no shouting, no fistfights, just the occasional passive-aggressive comment about soil quality. This isn't Wolf of Wall Street, it's Accountant of the Flower District. The system worked like this. You'd buy a contract for a bulb still in the ground, then sell that contract to someone else before the flower even emerged. Then they'd sell it again. And again. At some point, nobody actually wanted the tulip, they just wanted the slip of paper saying they owned it. Historians still argue whether this counts as a true futures market or just collective delusion. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some contracts changed hands up to 10 times before anyone saw so much as a sprout. The bulbs became abstract concepts, like NFTs, but with actual, if minimal, utility. What made this especially dull was the paperwork. Each transaction required meticulous records of previous owners, like a floral chain of custody. There were ledgers tracking ledgers, receipts for receipts, and enough notary stamps to make a bureaucrat weep. The Dutch invented modern finance and immediately used it to create the most tedious version of gambling imaginable. Meanwhile, actual gardeners kept tending their flower beds, completely unaware that the bulbs they were watering had been bought and sold 6 times that week. The tulips themselves remained blissfully indifferent, slowly photosynthesizing while men in stuffy rooms argued about their theoretical value. Let's talk about tulip futures, the financial instrument so dry it could cure meat. You're now in the winter of 1636, when Dutch merchants took the already sleep-inducing bulb trade and distilled it into pure contractual abstraction. No flowers, no dirt, just inky fingerprints on parchment as men traded promises about future promises. The paperwork had paperwork. The system was simple in its tedium. In November, you'd buy the right to a bulb that wouldn't be dug up until May. Not the bulb itself, just the option to maybe buy it later. These contracts changed hands all winter like holiday fruitcakes nobody actually wants. By February, a single Viceroy tulip bulb, a variety that looked like someone spilled paint on it, might have 20 theoretical owners, none of whom had ever touched soil. Historians still argue whether this was financial innovation or mass hysteria with extra receipts. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some contracts included clauses about acts of God, but not acts of rodents, leading to lawsuits when mice ate the collateral. The trading sessions themselves were exercises in restrained chaos. Instead of stock exchange bells, you had tavern keepers banging mugs on tables to signal new offers. Prices inched upward with all the drama of a sundial's shadow. No dramatic crashes yet, just dozens of men nodding solemnly as they swapped claims on flowers that wouldn't exist for months. The real miracle is that anyone stayed awake through it. Meanwhile, in actual gardens across Holland, the tulips in question were safely buried underground, completely unaware they'd become the 17th century's most overanalyzed vegetable matter. While merchants debated their theoretical value, the bulbs were just being bulbs. Cold, dormant, unimpressed. The so-called tulip mania peak arrives not with a bang, but with the financial equivalent of a slightly raised eyebrow. You're in a Haarlem tavern in January 1637, where a single Semper Augustus bulb just traded for enough guilders to buy a canal-side townhouse. The buyer doesn't even want the flower, he just needs to say he owns it. Across the room, a merchant yawns as he scribbles down the price in his ledger. This is history's most anticlimactic economic bubble. Prices are technically soaring, but you'd never know it from the atmosphere. There are no champagne corks popping, no traders dancing on tables, just the scratch of quills on paper as more contracts change hands. The famous 12 acres of land for one bulb story? Probably exaggerated, but even if true, it would have been a very polite, notarized transaction. Historians still argue whether this constituted actual mania or just mild collective poor judgment. But here's a quirky tidbit. At the height of the frenzy, some buyers refused to pay unless the tulip petals had exactly 37 stripes. Not 36. Not 38. Dutch commerce at its most fastidious. The actual sales process was bureaucratic to the point of self-parody. Each transaction required a notary to verify the contract, 2 witnesses to watch the notary, a scribe to record the witnessing, a tax assessor to calculate the stamp duty, several hours of everyone's life they'd never get back. Meanwhile, the tulip bulbs themselves remained underground, oblivious to their skyrocketing paper value, slowly gathering nutrients like sensible organisms. The peak of tulip prices arrives with all the fanfare of a damp firecracker. You're sitting in a Haarlem tavern on February 3, 1637, where history's most overhyped economic bubble is about to, well, not so much burst as develop a slow leak. A bulb that sold for 1,500 guilders yesterday fetches only 1,200 today. Someone mutters about market corrections. Another merchant shrugs and orders more beer. This is the Dutch Golden Age's idea of financial panic. The famous crash wasn't some dramatic plummet, just a gradual realization that maybe, perhaps, paying a year's wages for a flower bulb was slightly ill-advised. No stock market floor riots, no bankers jumping from windmills, windmill safety being one area where the Dutch actually showed restraint. Just a bunch of merchants looking at their account books and collectively deciding to pretend the last 6 months never happened. Historians still argue whether this even qualifies as a true economic collapse, but here's a quirky tidbit. Some sellers tried enforcing their contracts through the courts, leading to the world's most boring legal battles over whether bulb of good quality meant anything enforceable. The aftermath played out with typical Dutch pragmatism. Town councils declared all tulip contracts voidable for a small penalty, about 3.5% of the contract value. Most merchants paid the fee, shrugged, and went back to trading herring like sensible people. The few stubborn holdouts insisting on payment found themselves politely but firmly ostracized from business circles. Meanwhile, actual tulip growers kept tending their gardens, completely unfazed that their flowers were no longer worth a small castle. The Great Tulip Crash of 1637 unfolds with all the intensity of a nap interrupted by distant church bells. You're a Harlem notary in March 1637, watching as buyers who once fought over bulbs now fight over not having to pay for them. The courtroom arguments are spectacularly petty. The contract clearly states Viceroy bulb of medium size. This one is at least 3% smaller than average. Judges sigh deeply as merchants debate millimeter differences in circumference. This isn't financial collapse, it's the world's most boring game of hot potato. The Dutch response to the crisis was characteristically practical and underwhelming. Town councils didn't bail anyone out, they simply ruled that contracts could be voided for a 3.5% fee. Most traders paid the penalty just to stop thinking about tulips, like someone tipping a waiter to take away cold soup. Historians still argue whether this was a brilliant market correction or just everyone agreeing to pretend the madness never happened. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some sellers tried to enforce deals by arguing the bulbs had sentimental value, which the courts rejected with the 17th century equivalent of an eye roll. Meanwhile, the actual tulip market kept existing. Prices stabilized at about 10% of their peak, still absurd, just not castle money absurd. Growers still sold bulbs, enthusiasts still bred new varieties, and life went on with typical Dutch pragmatism. The only real casualty was pride. No one wanted to admit they'd paid a year's wages for something a rabbit might casually eat. The aftermath of tulip mania settles over Holland like a light morning fog, present, but hardly worth changing your plans over. You're a guild accountant in 1640, flipping through ledger entries that alternate between tulip transactions and purchases of cheese, herring, and other sensible Dutch commodities. The pages tell a story not of economic ruin, but of mild embarrassment swiftly buried beneath more important business. Contrary to popular myth, the Dutch economy didn't collapse under the weight of worthless flower contracts. The East India Company kept importing spices, windmills kept turning, and merchants still got rich, just not from tulips anymore. Historians still argue whether the episode even qualified as a true economic crisis, but here's a quirky tidbit. Some enterprising traders repurposed their tulip ledgers to track timber shipments, simply scratching out Viceroy bulb and writing Norwegian pine underneath. Waste not, want not. The real impact was psychological. Tulips became that one ill-advised purchase everyone pretends never happened, the 17th century equivalent of a crypto bro quietly deleting his Coinbase app. You'd occasionally overhear tavern conversations where men muttered about that whole bulb business before quickly changing the subject to more respectable topics, like herring prices or the weather. Meanwhile, actual tulip growers, who had never stopped tending their gardens, shook their heads and got back to work. The flowers, oblivious as ever, continued to bloom each spring with quiet reliability. The legal aftermath of tulip mania drags on through Dutch courts like a particularly stubborn case of athlete's foot. You're a clerk in the Haarlem courthouse in 1642, transcribing yet another case of Vandermeer versus De Vries over an allegedly substandard tulip bulb delivered 5 years too late. The plaintiff claims the bulb produced flowers with only 22 stripes instead of the promised 24. The defense counters that stripes can't be guaranteed because only God controls the petals. The judge sighs and asks if they'd consider settling over a nice herring. These lawsuits reveal the true absurdity of the tulip trade. Contract disputes hinge on definitions like bulb of reasonable size. Answer: whatever the judge had for breakfast that morning. Some cases take years to resolve because no one can agree whether a withered, possibly dead bulb still holds value. Historians still argue whether these proceedings helped stabilize the economy or just gave lawyers job security. But here's a quirky tidbit. One case was delayed when the evidence, an actual tulip bulb, sprouted in the courthouse storage room, adding biological evidence tampering to the docket. Meanwhile, the Dutch legal system adapts with characteristic pragmatism. New notary rules require bulb contracts to include detailed sketches because, as one magistrate puts it, apparently red with white bits means different things to different people. By 1645, most remaining cases are settled through mediation, usually involving the exchange of goods actually useful in daily life, like cheese or firewood. The myth of tulip mania grows far more dramatic than the reality ever was. You're in an 18th century London coffee house, listening to a British merchant spin wild tales about Dutch traders jumping into canals over flower debts. The truth? Most participants simply paid their 3.5% contract cancellation fee and moved on with their lives like nothing happened. But where's the fun in that? These exaggerated accounts, many written by foreign observers with axes to grind, created the legend we know today. Suddenly, the mundane paperwork of bulb trading transformed into a morality play about greed and folly. Historians still argue whether the myth says more about Dutch economics or foreign schadenfreude. But here's a quirky tidbit. One 18th century critic claimed the Dutch traded entire breweries for single roots, despite brewery prices being meticulously recorded at exactly 0 breweries exchanged for tulips. The reality was far less cinematic. Bankruptcy records from the period show more people ruined by herring price fluctuations than tulips. The few actual court cases reveal disputes so petty they'd put a modern small claims judge to sleep, arguments over a handful of guilders, not fortunes. Even the famous bulb worth a mansion was likely just a hypothetical example in a sermon about moderation, repeated until it became fact. Meanwhile, Dutch horticulturalists kept perfecting new tulip varieties with all the quiet determination of people who never got the memo they were supposed to be ruined. The flowers themselves, indifferent to human drama, continued their annual cycle of growth, bloom, and decay, as they had for centuries, and would for centuries more. Modern economists love invoking tulip mania as the ultimate cautionary tale, despite understanding almost none of its actual context. You're in a 21st century finance seminar where some analyst in a too-tight suit compares Bitcoin to 17th century Dutch flowers. The professor nods sagely, ignoring how tulip contracts were more regulated than most modern derivatives. The PowerPoint slide shows a dramatic price crash graph that, if you squint, might actually represent herring futures instead. These lazy historical parallels collapse under minimal scrutiny. Tulip speculation lasted months, not years, involved physical assets, not abstract tokens, and left the Dutch economy basically fine. Historians still argue whether the episode even belongs in the bubble category, but here's a quirky tidbit. The famous tulip mania price charts everyone copies were actually invented in the 1980s by an economist extrapolating from seven actual transactions. That's like reconstructing the stock market from a grocery receipt and a post-it note. The real lesson isn't about irrational exuberance. It's about how boring paperwork can make even the craziest speculation manageable. Dutch contract law absorbed the shock through meticulous record-keeping and standardized penalties. Compare that to modern crypto exchanges where assets vanish because someone forgot a password. Maybe the 17th century knew something we don't. Meanwhile, actual tulip growers, who never stopped their work, now supply a global cut flower market worth billions. The bulbs that once inspired courtroom dramas today fill Dutch auction houses by the crate, sold alongside lilies and roses with no more ceremony than potatoes. The flowers themselves remain unchanged, silent witnesses to centuries of human folly, still blooming right on schedule every spring. The modern tulip trade operates with all the glamour of a wholesale potato auction. You're in a vast Alsma warehouse at 4:30 a.m., watching Dutch flower brokers sip coffee while electronic boards display lot numbers like Tulip Strong Gold, 10,000 stems, Grade 2. No one mentions Semper Augustus. No one reminisces about 1637. The only frenzy here is the forklift drivers racing to meet the 7 a.m. shipment deadline. Global tulip production has become a monument to Dutch pragmatism. The same country that once allegedly traded farms for flowers now grows them by the billions. Efficiently, unceremoniously, and with military-grade logistics. Historians still argue whether this represents capitalism maturing or just the Dutch being allergic to drama. But here's a quirky tidbit. The world's most advanced tulip breeding program is run by a co-op called the Test Garden, where new varieties are judged on criteria like stem rigidity and shipping survivability. Romance is dead. Long live supply chains. The auction process itself would put a caffeine addict to sleep. Flowers sell by the crate in seconds, prices adjusting algorithmically based on yesterday's airline cargo capacity. The few remaining whimsical touches, like naming new varieties after celebrities, feel perfunctory. A recent tulip dubbed Taylor's version was downgraded for inconsistent petal count. Meanwhile, the bulbs themselves remain stoically indifferent, piling up in climate-controlled warehouses like so many beige marbles. So why does any of this matter? The honest answer: barely at all. The tulip bubble wasn't the first economic frenzy, nor the worst. Just the one that happened to involve pretty flowers, making it infinitely more memeable than, say, the 1720 South Sea Company collapse, which actually ruined people. The Dutch moved on within months. The global economy barely noticed. Even the tulips themselves kept doing exactly what they'd always done: grow, bloom, wilt, repeat. Historians still argue whether the episode deserves its outsized reputation, but here's a quirky final tidbit. The Semper Augustus, the most coveted tulip of the mania, went extinct by the 1650s. Not from economic collapse, but because a virus causing its prized streaks also weakened the plant. The Dutch simply bred new varieties and forgot about it. Such is the fate of all financial frenzies. They dissolve into footnotes while the world trudges forward. The real legacy lies in the paperwork. Those tedious contracts, notarized trades, and guild regulations became the scaffolding of modern finance. When today's traders buy oil futures or crypto options, they're participating in systems the Dutch flower brokers would recognize instantly, though they'd probably tut at the lack of stamped parchment. As for the tulips, they won. You can buy 50 for the price of a coffee today. They decorate weddings, cheer up hospital rooms, and fill supermarket buckets every spring. The flowers outlasted the hype, the speculation, even the people who once traded houses for them. There's something comforting in that. And so we come to the end of our journey through history's most overrated financial drama. Picture those fields in the Netherlands now. Endless rows of color stretching to the horizon under soft gray skies. The air smells of damp earth and green growth. Auction houses stand empty until dawn. Somewhere, a bulb slowly pushes through dark soil, following rhythms older than stock markets, older than guilds, older than human folly. The lesson, if there is one, isn't about greed or bubbles, it's about perspective. The tulips never cared about their price tags. The earth keeps turning regardless of ledgers. Next spring, the flowers will bloom again exactly as they have for centuries. No more or less beautiful for having once been absurdly expensive. Let that thought settle over you now. The contracts faded. The ledgers closed. But the tulips were always just tulips. Breathe in. Breathe out. The night is quiet. The story is done.